Can you keep a promise to a friend? In this story, we will see how two best buddies define what true friendship is. Let's watch O. Henry's After 20 Years. While watching, you are given a prompt to determine the focus of the material viewed. Let's get started.
After 20 years. The incident in the story takes place on a dark, windy New York City business avenue where a policeman discovers a man standing in a dark doorway. The policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night, but the chilly gusts of wind with a taste of rain in them had left the streets empty and deserted. When about midway of a certain block, the policeman suddenly slowed his walk.
Let's find out how O. Henry used the five key elements of a short story, which is entitled After 20 Years, to write this great short story. Also, discover how the element of time is gleaned in his short story. And while watching the film, you saw the first question. Let's go back to the first question. What do you see in the scene? I want you to circle the words in the text that answer this question. Okay, let's find it out. So we can see here that the policeman on the beat moved up the avenue. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night. There's a chilly gust of wind with a taste of rain. And this policeman was twirling his club with many intricate and artful movements. So those are the words that would help you identify the setting of the story. Now that we have already defined what short story is, let's talk about the plot. A plot has three basic parts: the beginning, middle, and end. These parts are used to develop a basic idea from the arrangement of scenes, and these are arranged in a logical manner or chronological order. A plot is composed of five important parts: the introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. An introduction, it is the part where the characters and settings are explained comprehensively. The rising action, it is the part where scenes eventually become complicated because of trouble or conflict in the story. Climax, it's the most exciting part where the interest of the readers or audience is heightened. It is also referred to as the peak of the story. And falling action, the part that describes the result of the climax. And the ending of the story, wherein the problems are gradually resolved, we call it the resolution.
A man was leaning in the doorway of a darkened hardware store with an unlighted cigar in his mouth. As the policeman walked up to him, the man explained quickly that he was waiting there for a friend. It was an appointment that had been made 20 years ago. The man said that about that long ago, there used to be a restaurant there. It had been called Big Joe Brady's Restaurant. The policeman confirmed that the restaurant had been there till 5 years ago, when it had been torn down. The man in the doorway struck a match and lit a cigar. The light showed a pale, square-jawed face with keen eyes and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. His scarf pin was a huge diamond, oddly set. The man said that he had dined at Big Joe Brady's restaurant exactly 20 years ago with Jimmy Wells, his best chum. He had been 18 and Jimmy was then 20. He was to start for the West to make his fortune, while one couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. They had agreed that night that they would meet there again, exactly 20 years from that date and time, no matter what their conditions might be, or from what distance they might have to come.
Let us answer this question. Could this appointment made 20 years ago have something to do with the title of the story? But before we answer this question, let us take a look at the second paragraph. And here's the dialogue. I'm just waiting for a friend. It's an appointment made 20 years ago. It was said by Bob, trying to explain why he was at the hardware store at 10 o'clock p.m. In my answer, I guess it's a yes. This appointment made 20 years ago could have something to do with the title of the story. As mentioned earlier, this story tells about two friends who have been separated for a long time. They made a promise to meet at the hardware store, and the title also shows the opposing views of two characters in terms of how they deal with life. Now we are approaching the exposition. To determine the exposition, which is an important element in the plot, I will leave you a question. How did the story start that somehow piqued the curiosity of the readers upon seeing the main character's habitual action? Let's answer the second question. What ideas and feelings do you have about the man waiting for his friend? And we are referring to Bob. If I hadn't known Bob as a criminal, I would have believed that he was such a true friend. He treasured his friendship with Jimmy. But notice some peculiarities in the story. It was already nighttime, but Bob seemed to have prepared himself for this meeting with Jimmy. He was wearing an expensive suit and jewelry. So, what does it imply? Simply, he would want Jimmy to see how he has achieved all these fortunes. So, what do you think is the rising action of the story?
The policeman found the incident quite interesting and asked him if he had heard from his friend since he had left. The man replied that they had indeed corresponded for a time, but after a year or two had lost track of each other. But he was sure that Jimmy would meet him there if he was alive, for he had always been the truest, staunchest old chap in the world. The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds. He said that he had done pretty well for himself in the West, and he hoped that Jimmy had done half as well as him.
What is the meaning of corresponded? It means having to communicate with someone through exchange of letters. Bob and Jamie kept in touch when they parted ways. Do you think if the policeman were Jimmy talking to Bob today, would he be proud of his friend who seemed to be enjoying all the things that glitter like gold? Before we proceed to the second part of our discussion, please go back to your handout and underline words or phrases that you can use to identify the plot of the story.